Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And this week, we're jamming cards like it's 2001. Well, sort of. We're taking on Riftforce, a dynamic, hand management, modular setup dueling card game in which players draft unique player powers, represented by elemental guilds like grass, fire, ice, shadows, crystal, we ran out of elements, to wipe their opponents off the board. So we're doing our classic deep dive, and also, promise you, we're going to do, in real time, Jake might not even know we're doing this, a tier list of elemental guilds, where we're each going to give our thoughts, and then we'll create a ranking, and then we'll read it out on the show. Jake, are you excited about that idea? And are you excited about this episode?
I'm such a big tier list fan. I just put everything in my life into tiers. I can't help it. I think that's something that the fighting game community stuff I've done before has really rubbed off on me. So I'm into tier lists. Let's do Castle of Burgundy tile tiers next. Let's go.
Amazing. That's going to be we'll do a micro mini episode just talking about tiles. Jake's not even joking. I've seen his tier list of breakfast foods. Also, I had issues with it, but I can't remember what they are. So more importantly, moving on, Jake, I want to know your thoughts on Riftforce. Let's kick it off with your pithy review and rating.
Okay. I am giving Riftforce a 9.5 out of 10.
Whoa.
Riftforce is, it's a Jake game. I love dueling card games. It's probably my favorite genre, and this gets so much about that right in such an elegant and small rule set that makes it accessible to anyone after 5 minutes, which I think is a huge burden to overcome with so many other games in the dueling two-player card game space. I have a couple issues that keep this from being a 10 for me that we'll get into later. But this is just an elegant game, small package. And the thing that's impressed me most is how much I've learned about this game and how my thinking about it has continued to evolve with every subsequent play. So easy to learn, difficult to master, enough said.
That's your highest score in a long time.
It's definitely my game of the year so far for Decision Space.
Yeah. And we're 6 months in. I was going to say, I'm like teleported back to 2001 where you actually liked games. Okay, so here's why, Jake. If you're looking for a fighty hand management game that plays differently every time, Riftforce is the game for you. Starting with the draft, the decisions in Riftforce are interesting, rich, and seemingly really nuanced. There's ample room for strategic counterplay and interesting tactical shots. And while there's times where Riftforce plays impeccably and has the flow and back and forth of the best dueling games out there, I think, unfortunately, there's also moments where the whole affair drags and interesting downbeats that the check and draw turns create sort of feel clunky and frustrating rather than harmonious with the rest of the design. However, the unfolding depth of the decision space really does have me hooked. So I'm giving it 8 riffs out of 10. There's only 5 riffs in the game, though. So I guess this is a modified 4 out of 5 riffs. How's that work?
Sure. I don't know. You
Jake's like, what is the scale? I don't know.
You do whatever you want.
Great. Awesome. Wonderful. So a bit of game background. This is a really new game. It came out in 2021, and it was designed by Carlo Bortolini and published by One More Time Games, which I believe is Carlo Bortolini's company, and that he kickstarted the game, and then it was picked up for distribution after a really successful Kickstarter by companies like Capstone and other publishers to help give the game a wider release. And I think this makes a ton of sense because Riftforce has the feel of a lot of really classic sort of battle line style card games like Lost Cities or Battle Line of Renuncia or Schottentotten. And I think even will sort of appeal to the type of board gamer who likes games like a newer game, Air, Land, and Sea, where you have this line of locations between the two players and you're vying for control of those. So all of these sort of fall in this like battle line dueling card game subgenre.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that's so clever about Riftforce as a product is that I think it can really capture the imagination and appeal to people coming from that Euro game, Reiner Knizia space, and people coming to this from something like Keyforge or Magic the Gathering or any other number of sort of like more American style LCG or collectible card game.
Totally. Which is really a pretty remarkable achievement. And the way that it does it is really clever with the different guilds. But I think we should get into that after a little bit of housekeeping, which is that next week we're either going to be covering Lost Cities as sort of a companion piece to this episode, or we're going to be doing a What We Talk About episode on sort of two connected but different topics, which is the size/scope of decision spaces and the idea of depth. So pre-planners can just play Lost Cities and prepare. It'll come at some point, whether it's next week or the week after. And if you'd like to sort of give us your thoughts, well, after this episode releasing, you might have 24 hours to weigh in on if you'd rather the episode be Lost Cities or this What We Talk About next week. You could do that just by coming to our Discord or sending us a message on Patreon. If you're a patron and you'd like to support the making of more episodes like this, you can find the Discord link in our show notes. And if you're interested in some sort of, I like Decision Space, or, this is my favorite board game podcast, I really want them to keep doing this and I want it to exist and I want to support its existence, check out decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon. And that's awesome. Now let's just do the real thing, which is the actual show, which we love. And I know you want to hear us talk about Riftforce.
Yeah, so let's jump right into Brendan's rules overview, and then we'll get into the meat of this discussion.
Riftforce is a hand management battle line style dueling card game for 2 players. Here's the hook of Riftforce. Each play is functionally unique. Every game begins with players drafting a team of 4 elemental guilds, each with their own special activated power that informs the decisions that player will make over the course of the game. After the draft, players vie for control of 5 lanes, or elemental rifts, to which they will play cards and try to remove their opponent's presence through dealing damage with activated effects. Each player begins a game of Riftforce with 7 cards. On their turn, they play 1 to 3 cards from their hand to the board. These cards must share a value, 5, 6, or 7, or a type, fire, wind, crystal, gems, etc. Or they can activate 1 to 3 cards by discarding a card, and the activated cards must share a value or type with the discarded card. So if you discard Earth, you can activate 3 Earths on your board, or if you discard a 6, you can activate 3 6s on your board. The final option is that if a player has fewer than 7 cards in their hand, they can check and draw, gaining points for each rift that they have a presence in where their opponents do not, and also draw back up to 7 cards. Players also gain a point for destroying an enemy card, and once a player hits 12 or more points, the game end is triggered. Then after their opponent takes 1 additional turn, the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
I think that was a really strong intro. I think we really nailed that. Pat on the back.
Awesome. Thank you. I can't even tell if we're recording right now because that was lovely of Jake to say on the air. So I'm just going to play it off as we are. I think we did a good job too. There was good flow there. Just like the draft of this game, I think has really good flow.
Yeah, we're getting better with each and every podcast, just like one would develop skills in... Okay, no, that's too much.
Maybe. Well, maybe. I feel like I've plateaued in this game, but the goal is to get better and better. You probably feel like you're getting better and better because we keep playing and you keep beating me by more.
Well, yes and no, because I would say... So we've been playing with... I think both of us have been playing like repeated games against the same other third party, which is Cerule in our Discord. And he also has a podcast, or they have a podcast that I would love to shout out. It is a French language podcast that I do not know the name of off the top of my head, but I will correct that in the edit and include a link to that in our show notes.
It's called Board Game Duel.
So I've been playing against Cerule, and what I've found has been so interesting about this game is that we are just going on streaks of wins. So Cerule's beating me many, many games in a row, and then I'm starting to figure out something new, and then I'm beating them many games in a row, and then it kind of has switched back and forth instead of like trading off games. And I think that has given me this sense of that real improvement is happening in the gameplay more so than if we're just like alternating wins.
To me, that is also indicative of the fact that there are different real steps on the skill chain in this game where you sort of get to a new level, you can win for a while, someone catches up, then they eclipse you on the skill ladder, and then you have to sort of unlock a new understanding of the systems of the game to get to that next rung on the skill chain. You eclipse that person, and you're sort of taking turns crawling over each other up the skill ladder as you're sort of chasing each other up the skill ladder and deepening your understanding of the game.
Yeah, and I think that's something just in really general terms that really appeals to me in the dueling card game genre are games that have like a clear and high skill ceiling, and I think that this
Mm,
accomplishes that. Um, any game that is you drawing from a deck of cards uh, is going to have a high element of randomness, right? And chance by virtue of drawing cards. And so I think, it is really important to me specifically that there is enough of a skill ceiling there to balance out that so it doesn't
mm.
feel like a chaotic and random affair. And I think that was one of the things that really hooked me on Keyforge initially, was just realizing that as I get better, like my win rate becomes consistently high. And I think that is something that I've seen mirrored so far in my plays of Riftforce.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I feel like we're doing a subsection on what draws us to this type of game before we get into like our typical discussion of the decision space overall. And I feel like another key point that maybe for me pulls back my rating slightly with this one is that what draws me to these games, Jake, because obviously we're both huge fans of Keyforge and think it's like the best thing since Richard Garfield invented cardboard, is is the potential feeling for creative problem solving in the games, where you feel like you're doing something that the game allows but doesn't intend. I think that that's what makes me love Keyforge, right? Where like I get to do a thing and I feel like, oh, maybe I'm the only person who has a deck that will ever let me do this. Or you see a combo that it's sort of like, wow, how did these three pieces come together to create this amazing synergy? And where A plus B plus C is equal to more than A, B, and C on its own. And I think that there's some of that in Riftforce. But one thing that's interesting about the systems for me is that I think a lot of the combos are you put A and B together, and there were slightly more than A and B on their sides, but they're sort of you don't go beyond that, right? There are some 3-card combos, but it feels somewhat linear. And I think that the ways in which I feel like I've learned more is through the structure of my cards within certain lanes and how I'm laying out different values. And that's where I'm getting better at the game. I'm not getting better at using the powers because the powers themselves are more straightforward in this game and linear. And the creative depth comes through the actual positioning, which I think speaks to the strength of this genre to contain ample room for like nuanced implications of simple changes with where objects in the system go.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the system so good. Well, and the powers are good because they make the game approachable, like you said. But if you're drawn to a game because you're into super cool different powers, they're here and they're going to hook you. But that's not where the depth exists. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
I think I am halfway with you. I think
Okay.
for
I'll
me,
take halfway.
yeah, I think for me, definitely, I agree that like the biggest learning and improvement I've experienced with the game is in how I am playing out my hand of cards, and
Whether it's looking at the type or the
yeah,
value or,
exactly, and
yeah.
figuring out like the. But a big part of that has been, more recently is like figuring out the best way to layer my different suits within
Those
the
rows
various
or the
the
column.
various battle lines for lack of a better term,
Yep.
which does have to do with the powers. And I do think it, obviously Keyforge, uh, I guess some games are sort of now trying to replicate that, but Keyforge is sort of in a class of its own for uniqueness of deck. But I
Yeah.
do think this has an element of that. I mean, I haven't crunched the numbers myself, but you have 9 different suits in the game, right?
Yep. I've crunched the numbers. Are you going to
Okay.
say team comps?
Yeah, what's the number?
Yeah,
What
5,040 different team compositions in the base game.
Right. So that is a lot of play before you are exhausting the possibilities of learning the ways different powers interact with each other. And yeah, and I do agree. Like mostly as of now, am identifying like really strong 2 faction synergies.
Course.
Right.
Yeah.
Like okay, ice is really reliably good with thunder because thunder allows you to target any of your opponent's uh, elements in their battle lines. You could pick the back one, and then ice does only attacks the back one and does extra damage if it's already damaged. So having those together in a battle line that works well together. But just to finish my thought, like it is becoming more and more clear to me that the synergies go beyond just picking out
Mm.
two element synergies and trying to jam those together, because there are some sets of 3 and 4 that just create like more you know uh, like a sum that is greater than its individual parts, and I haven't yet like been able to like identify or put my finger exactly on like what 3 and 4 set combos are going to bring out the best in all of them.
It's very interesting. I feel like as much as we can, Jake, for people who haven't played, let's try to define like the whole card if we can.
Yeah.
So like with Thunder, deal 2 damage to any card in the row. If that destroys a card, do it again. And Ice says deal 1 damage to the last card in the row in the column, except if there's already damage on it, then deal 4 instead. I feel like I'm mixed because I do feel like what I'm saying, I know that there's depth there that goes beyond this, right? And I've had those moments that feel really cool of finding those synergies between 3 of the groups, or finding a core that works really well, where it's like, okay, you have Thunder, which allows you to damage the back row, and Ice, which takes advantage of that. And then you bring in something like Earth, and maybe early on, Earth, when you play it, deals 1 damage to every card in a column and deals 2 damage when you activate it to the first in that column. Works really well because maybe you can lay down your Thunders and Ice early and then save a lot of your Earths to play them all in a turn later and sort of overwhelm one of the columns where your opponent has stacked up a bunch of cards. They're definitely there. But I do feel that this claim, and now I feel like we spent way too much time on this, but this claim of the depth comes in the positioning as much as it does in the combos is key, and maybe a feature of the game, not a bug, that we should be aware of up front, because I think the game sells itself about being as so much about the powers, and it is. It changes the feel dramatically, but it's also, and maybe it's because the game is consistently the same in terms of the positioning, the values, and the types. That's where a lot of the depth comes in. But let's talk about the shape and the feel and the type of decision space.
Let's do that. I have more thoughts on that conversation, but I think that they will come up later in this conversation.
Yeah, it's going to like intertwine with everything we discuss, I think. Do you want to do the honor of like defining the decision space?
Yeah, man, I should have thought about this before we started recording. I think that the decision space feels, I don't think it's waxing, and I don't think it's waning.
It's dynamic.
So yeah, I would say it's either static or dynamic, and I think you could make a case for either or, just because there are really strong static characteristics of the decision space, which is that you will always have 3 main actions that you can choose. Sometimes only 2 if you have a full hand of 7 cards, which is check and draw, activating, or playing cards. So that is going to confine the band of the decision space to a really small number of considerations up front. And then when you get into each of them, I think again, right, you're only going to have 1 or 2 possible decisions that would really make sense when you look at your hands of what cards to play. And then same with like activation, because you're going to need the right card to activate it, and you need to have opposing elementals opposite of your damage dealing ones to choose those. So again, like you're so constrained. All of those things are doing so much to constrain the decision space, and yet I find when I play this game, like tons of tremendously challenging decisions to make within that, right? When I'm choosing, even if I know I have to play out exactly these 3 cards because they're maybe the only set, whether it is a number set of 3 5s or a set of 3 of the same elemental that I can play. It's the only way to get 3 elementals out on the board. Determining like where to place those, whether all 3 in the same row or spread across the board in 3 different rift areas or battle line areas, which I guess is the term we'll use interchangeably, is really tough. And I think like you can really, if you want to sort of like go deep into thinking through the implications of any of those, and I think the same is true when activating cards. Like there are so many of these like little decisions that come up that isn't on many of them. It's not just activate, deal damage, though some are like that. But when you have an elemental like water, which allows you to do 2 damage to the opposite elemental in the front of the line opposite it, and then move left or right and deal 1 damage there. Thinking about the implications of moving that elemental around, both in terms of the composition of the following lanes, where you want to deal damage, how much damage is on the water elemental itself, because moving it is likely going to hide and protect it by getting to the back of the line. Like there's just a ton to think about in any one of these spaces, which kind of makes the decision space feel. I still struggle. Like it's small but large, and I think that's kind of a hallmark of a great game for me, or at least a game that I tend to really get drawn to.
I think that this is going to tie into our conversation, whether it's next week or the week after, really well, because I think it's small decision space, but it's a deep decision space, right? And I think that that's the interesting thing about this game. Like the number of options you're presented with aren't massive, but the number of meaningful considerations that goes into one of those decisions can be quite large. And the cognitive abilities that you're being asked of by the game are within reach for you. Like it's not so much meaningful information that you're like, oh, whatever, it means nothing because there's too much to ever care about. No, like it's just we've talked about on the show before, Jake, how some of the best games sit just beyond the ability of your own cognitive horizon. I think this game is that way, where you find yourself making mistakes some small percentage of the time, but that makes you want to try even harder.
Right.
To like parse everything. I feel like, so I agree it's dynamic, right? The check draw system and the way that your hand is building up and shrinking down really makes the game feel like you have this dynamic flow of decisions where things will branch and then constrict a little bit and then branch again. And the board is building up, but it's also shrinking down, and how that happens matters. And I think also importantly, every game has the potential to have a different shape depending on the elements that are in play, which I think is also kind of something that we've talked about in the past as being this sort of like textbook flag of being a dynamic decision space where different plays of that game can feel differently. And I think that if you like games like that, Riftforce has that in spades. But you said something where I kind of want to kick off the next discussion that is leaving our notes behind slightly, and then we can maybe return to them. But that's that. I think that the rule book never says defense. There's no word of like, in this mode you're playing offense and in this mode you're playing defense. And like when you're thinking about the decisions in this way, you need to think defensively. And when you activate your abilities, you're thinking about the offensive and defensive abilities. But it is in the game. It's just hidden within the rules. And I think that that's where a lot of that depth comes in. Like you were saying, Jake, with, okay, maybe I'm going to use my water 7 in this lane to deal 2 at the front, but it's because I want to tuck it into my next lane to the back where it's going to be safe, hiding behind these other cards, and prevent them from using maybe their shadow, which allows them to move a shadow element and deal 1 damage. But if it destroys something, they get 2 for it. Maybe I need to take a downbeat turn to move my water elemental that 1 damage will destroy it, allowing them to get 2 points. So I'm moving it to deal damage, yes, but I'm playing defensively to hide it behind. And I think that those defensive elements are what I was talking about earlier of the depth in the battle line system of this game, where it's not just what cards are in what rows, it's what cards are in what position and what rows that can really start to feel like it matters. And I like that so many of the powers, Jake, aren't just having to deal with, oh, I'm dealing damage here. It's how am I structuring my rows? And then also powers like the air elemental and the earth elemental is how can I structure the nature of my playing and drawing to make the most of this effect? The air elemental says move and deal 1 damage to the front of each of the new column and the adjacent ones, because I think those have real implications for the whole way you approach the puzzle of trying to control lanes. So there is a lot of depth here in the way that things are interacting.
And to just go back to kind of your thought about the learning and improvement in this game doesn't have as much to do with syncing powers together. I think that's true, but that is what creates that texture to the board state that you're trying to parse. And I think the more that you play with similar combinations, right? Like if you're like, okay, I really like water and fire. So I'm trying to draft them when they're available and learning a lot about how to use them best. That's going to help you. You're not going to necessarily learn more about that water ability that we've sort of talked about at depth, right? Because all the abilities are so straightforward. But I think it will improve your bandwidth while playing the game because of like being able to like just better intuit the situations when you need to be shifting from offense to defense, and when am I using this aggressively, when am I using it defensively. It's difficult for me to untie the powers and combinations from that tactical board play.
Yeah. So much of your skill in the game comes from not just how do I best attack my opponent, but how do I, through clever battle line placement, mitigate the strengths of my opponent's powers. And it's hard without playing those elements to know how you can best play against them.
Right. And I think it's fun too, like in this conversation, we're already so far from the first time I played Riftforce and what I was thinking about, right? Like
Because you're only thinking about the combos.
And you're only thinking about like damage, I think, right?
Yeah.
Or just how am I getting, you're just all offense, like how am I scoring points? And that's really, really analogous to tons of other games, right? We're just like, okay, I'm just like going for max efficiency, max points. Like, what am I doing here to score the most points? And that ultimately is not the best way to play the game in most situations. But that's all. It also it just kind of speaks to, I think, the strength of the system, that like that is a way, like you're definitely playing and engaging with the game in the same way in those initial plays. But as soon as you're done with that first play, at least for me, I was like, okay, I've done this all wrong. Like let's shuffle up and play again, because I'm already like seeing the errors and the ways I could do better. And like that feeling for me hasn't stopped, even though I've played this game probably 30, 40 times now.
I think that this game shares a lot in common with Keyforge, and that one of the most skill testing aspects is that the skill in this game is not just about what cards you play, but about what cards you choose not to play to save that resource for the future. And I think you were kind of getting at that, Jake, where like the skill in this game comes from like, I could play all 3 of these crystals down, but maybe I want to hold back my crystal 6 and just play the other 2 so I can activate both those crystals at a different point in time with that card, or activate all 6s, and that playing it to the board actually doesn't create much value. So I take a quote unquote inefficient turn and just play 2 cards so I can keep that card in my hand. And that hand management aspect, that's where that really gets highlighted in my mind. And I really like that aspect of the game.
Right.
What if we talk about the draft? And I feel like one thing that I didn't define in the rules explanation that would be helpful is just right now that we've talked about the game some, to define the deck composition of all these decks. Because I think that does inform the decisions a little bit. And every deck in the game, right? So there's 10 elemental guilds. Each of these decks has 4 value 5 cards, 3 value 6 cards, and 2 value 7 cards. Okay, now let's talk about the draft.
All right, great. So this game is a game that has very clearly 2 distinct parts. What we've been talking about thus far is the second part, playing out the game as a race to get 12 points. But the first part of this game, you will actually draft your deck live against your opponent, which I think is a really fun and engaging way to sort of balance this. I mean, you could very easily play this as just each person getting dealt 4 random elements and shuffle up your deck that way. But that's not what the designers have done. So instead, you'll shuffle up all 10. I think we said 9 earlier, but there's 10 guilds in the game. You'll discard 1 randomly, deal each person 1 that they're starting with, and then you'll take turns drafting from the remaining 7 until both people have 4 guilds.
I love that you randomly get 1 that you're forced to play with at the start.
Yeah.
I think that makes it so much more interesting because, like you said, Jake, there's this tension in the game where you do get comfortable with certain guilds. And I think being forced to have 1 at the start is just enough of a signpost to say, like, try to do something with this, right? That's how you end up playing sort of compositions that you might not normally end up in. And I think is pushing the player just enough to sort of say, learn more of this system, learn more of this game. Right. And there's so much to learn that it feels good.
It's like a forced exploration of the decision space.
Yeah.
In a way that honestly, like, is I think kind of bold as a design decision, right? It's like you might not want to, you might hate, I don't know, uh, shadows, right? That's just you don't
Yeah.
like playing it. It only does one damage compared to everything else. Like you haven't been able to make it work, but now you're starting with shadows, and the game puts you in a situation where you have to make the best of that,
Yep.
and that might cause you to draft one, other elementals or guilds that you haven't played with before, as like, okay, well, if it didn't work when I tried to pair it with ice, maybe it'll work when I try to pair it with water. And I think that is definitely adds a fun texture to the draft, and it also shortens the draft, so you're only
Yeah.
making three selections each. It's lightning quick.
I think it also makes it such that if in a certain meta, if there becomes a certain localized player meta, like if two people keep playing together and there become favorite guilds that are viewed as being really, really powerful, those would become the obvious opening picks that you would always go with. But because you're forced to pick a specific, not even pick, because you just have one at the outset, maybe it changes the way that it recontextualizes how you view all the other guilds, which means that your opening picks are going to have more variety than if it was just pick one of these 9, which then you might settle into just picking the same ones at the outset over and over, and that gets kind of stale. So it's a nice way to combat that problem. And I also really like that the draft, this is not a hidden information draft. At the outset, you're picking from 7 guilds, like Jake was saying, because I have one, Jake has one, and we've discarded one. So it's really interesting to have part of the skill of this game be able to analyze that information and sort of say, what are the possibilities from this point, right? These 7 are remaining. What would be the best case scenario for me? What's the best case scenario, or what's the best case scenario for Jake? And how do I prevent that while having the best case scenario for me? And I like those sort of higher order decisions where you're sort of being forced to think, okay, it might be really, really good for me to have X, but it'd be worse for Jake to have Y. So maybe I have to pick Y first just to deny that from Jake.
Right, exactly. And I think, I've been really, just like in the gameplay, like I think how my decision making and kind of knowledge of this game has improved in the draft portion thus far is really uh like not trying to say like I'm so smart, but like I really feel like I'm learning a lot, and like the draft has just become so much more interesting to me the more I play it. And I was talking to Cyril about this a bit as well, and we were both feeling like, wow, the draft, we're at a place playing this game against each other now where it feels like the draft portion is just as important as
Yeah.
the second part of the game, if not more so. Like it feels like you can like lose the game in the draft.
Mm,
And also importantly, like, it seems like, as you were saying, everybody agrees that like X and Y elements are the most powerful. And so the draft becomes really stagnant. I think Gem, we'll talk about our tier list, but Gem is the only element in the game that does 4 damage as like a base power. And that's just apparently strong. So, early on in the game, I think a lot of players might kind of gravitate towards that as being the strongest. But I think as I'm playing more, like I'm realizing that the power level of each element is so tied with the synergies that exist for it that you might take, if as both players realize 2 really powerful synergies, like so say Sarul is killing me because he keeps drafting gem and healing, which is I guess light together,
yeah.
then if at the start of the draft he takes gem, even if I think there's something else that exists that's stronger on its own than light, I might take light just so he can't have that combination. And now we're already going down a brand new path for the draft than we've done before.
Yeah. I do you think that every pair set, excuse me, not pair, every set of guilds could win in this game? Could you end up with a set of 4 that are just not good enough?
I don't think so. And I think that this also gets to the other thing that's really revealing itself to me about this game, which is that it's not just the synergies that matter, but it's that different uh, combinations of elements as they encounter a different combination of element is going to create a board state that plays out totally differently. So I think
Yeah.
you can get, and by that I mean like, some boards are going to be more stacked up. Like both players tend to have a lot of elements in the same uh, column. And there's no limit on that in this game. So theoretically, you could put 6 in there if you wanted to, whereas others are spread out. Some games just end up having a lot of elements on the board at once. In other games, it's constantly whittling each other's forces down. So I do think you can have, I mean, like there's a huge element of player skill. So like, I mean, I don't think that there's any 4 that like it'd be impossible to win with, but I think there are combinations of 4 that are going to put you at a huge disadvantage against the 4 that your opponent has ended up with, if that makes sense, like within that context.
And I think certainly some groupings of 4 are more flexible in the shape that the board can take, and some are much more restricted in sort of the viable paths in terms of how you build things out are, I think, just to leverage potential synergies that exist. But I think now is probably actually a really natural time, now that you've brought it up, Jake, is to talk about the decisions in sort of like going wide, playing to lots of cards to lots of different lanes, or going tall and playing lots of cards to individual lanes, because I think that that's where the decisions end up being really, really interesting. And one thing that we've talked about is we've mentioned a lot, one of the ways that you score points in Riftforce is destroying other people's elements. Every time you destroy an element, you get a point. If you destroy someone else's crystal, you get crystal element, you get 2. And if you destroy something with a shadow, you get 2. But another way is just by controlling lanes, which means, or lanes, columns, rifts, we have many words for this now, is by eradicating your opponent's presence there. So, or maybe they never had a presence at all. And when you do the action check draw, which means you check if you control any lanes, if you do, meaning you have cards on your side and your opponent doesn't have cards on theirs, you score a point and then you draw back up to 7. Let's talk about going wide versus tall, because I think this for me is the most interesting part of the game now that I've played 30 or so games. This is where I'm sort of like, these are the most important decisions, and they're the decisions I'm least sure of when I'm making them. Even from the beginning of like how to approach, when to start activating cards, because you could even, you can play out one hand of cards and then you have a choice. You're going to draw back up either way. Do you start activating those effects, or do you just like layer more cards down? Like that's another valid choice of when do you start using your rows? What's the critical mass of types and values?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't have an answer. Yeah.
It's hard.
I don't have an answer either, but I think like at a base level 1, like it's good to have an elemental in each row. That does a couple of things for you. It makes it so that if your opponent, for whatever reason, doesn't have any elemental in that row, it's applying pressure to them that they should put one there in order to stop you from getting that free rift point every time you check and draw. And that pressure is very real in this game because you're only going to 12 points. It's not that many. So, an uncontested row early in the game is 1 point towards your, that's 1/12 of the way to victory. So it helps you there by putting pressure to your opponent. And it also, of course, is blocking your opponent from having that same type of advantage. I think where things get interesting, though, is knowing also when like not to contest a lane anymore, right?
Yeah.
So if your opponent has 3, earth elements in one row, that they could just so earth, it does damage when they play it down. So earth elements have the tendency of stacking up in a row, because a lot of times a really strong play would be playing 3 earth elements to the same row if you've accumulated them in your hand, and dealing 3 damage to each element of your opponents in that row. So earth, but once they're down, they're staying put. They're not moving. Because all they do at that point is just 2 damage to the element in the front of the line ahead of them. So they have a tendency of stacking up in rows. And at that point, depending on, where in the game you are, you might be in a situation where like it's not worth it to you to try and contest that, because if you place an element down there, they can activate potentially next time and just immediately kill it, maintaining their advantage. and you're just feeding them an extra point for no reason. Um,
If you've played 3 crystals somewhere, I'm going to be hard pressed to add a single card there.
Right, because it's just so much damage that's coming at you. So
Yep.
I think that is really a consideration of tempo. Like, where in the game are you? Do you have a chance of being able to like overtake and actually like win that row? You know, and how many more times is somebody going to draw
Yeah.
again? Because it's not like you can't check and draw if you already have 7 cards in your hand, and B, like, it's not very efficient to keep going back to that well if I'm playing down 3 elements and activating 3 elements elsewhere. You know, if you're just getting, I'm probably going to be getting more value than an opponent who's trying to take advantage of a single open rift that they have by, I don't know, checking and drawing every other action. Like
Yep.
that's just, you're just going to get decimated on value in that case.
Right. And that becomes even more so if there's 2 uncontested rifts and they're getting 2 every time they do that. Then I think that's a clear path to victory.
Oh yeah.
I think there's a chance you can win this game by conceding 1 rift at some point in the game, like you're saying. But once you get to conceding 2, you've kind of conceded the game. You have to vie for at least having a presence in 4 of them. But not all lanes are created equal too.
Right.
The center lane is very, very important. Because every time that if you want to put down cards, like Jake said, you have to either put them all to the same row, the same rift, or spread across 3 that are adjacent. And 5 divided by 3, you're always going to overlap with that center row because you can't swing around to the left and right. So that puts us like a ton of pressure on that middle row. I feel like, in that middle lane to struggle against, and it plays this sort of outsized important role.
Right.
And then other rows become increasingly important just based on the resources that have been committed there, like we've talked about.
It could be viable to win the game giving up the outside row, but
Column.
probably
Yeah.
not, or yeah, the outside column, but probably not giving up the center column, because that means you're just relegated to using, you know, the 2 outside rows or columns. Dang it. Each time you're trying to play elemental, and that's just like, then you're giving up the efficiency.
It's too much forced
Yeah.
inefficiency.
I think the other things to think about when you talk about whether I'm going to go wide or tall is like the order of elements that you want to play. So I think like my first level 1 playing of this game was like, okay, gems are super powerful and deal a ton of damage, so I need to like slap them down first.
Yeah.
But now that I play it more, it's like, you know, what's really sweet is like having a really powerful gem element out there that's protected by having like something you don't care about as much in the front that they'll have to try and go through first, all the while taking massive hits of 4 damage from gems behind that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of, you know, and that's a really obvious example of a way you might want to order the elements in your deck. But I think all the different combination elements have similar considerations to make. So, you know, if in your hand, you know, you have only gems, right, to play, and you really want to play them for whatever reason, there's a lot of scenarios where that would come up. Like maybe you want to check and draw, but you'd rather early in the game draw a full hand of 7 cards instead of just adding 4 new ones. So you want to play the gems down first. If it's really early in the game and you don't have a wall up for them yet, that might be an opportunity where you want to put 3 gems together in the same row, right? Forcing your opponent to not want to contest that because of the potential massive damage output, and kind of creating that inherent shield that way, as opposed to, you know, sacrificing the potential advantage of having a shielded gem by just putting them in the front of 3 different rows where your opponent can pick them off and get that benefit, which is the gem's downside of rewarding an extra point to your opponent when they are defeated.
And when you're playing 3, then the decision of what values are you playing in what order comes into play, which I think is really interesting, because sometimes the right answer is going to be, okay, I want my high value ones in the back, because let's say your opponent has frost and they're attacking the back, or ice, they're attacking the back directly. I want them to be attacking my 7. So it would take 3 hits from an ice, not my 5 crystal, which would only take 2 hits, 1 damage to get damage on it, and then the 4 will finish it off. And I think that that's another way in which the decisions become really interesting in this game because of you have a ton of 5s in all 4 of your elemental decks. We talked about that earlier. We only have 2 7s, but the 7s are really strong defensively. But sometimes, so maybe you want to play down a lot of your 7s early. But then are you going to be able to save a 7 to call all of your 7s on the board at once?
Yeah.
Or do you want to play it out for defense? 7s are more defensive. 6s are more in between. 5s are more offensive, and you have more of them.
Which is such a interesting emergent design thing. Again, right? Going back to your point, like nothing in this game says offense versus defense, but just by virtue of, and we should just be clear, the elements work exactly the same way, 5, 6, and 7s. They have the exact same abilities on the card. They do the same amount of damage. It's just a difference in life and a difference in the number that you have in your deck. And by virtue of having fewer 7s, they are harder to activate, which makes them have lesser offensive capabilities than your 5s, which allows you to figure out over the course of play that's like, okay, these are defensive elements, even though the game never tells you that.
Yep. And your 5s, you want a lot of them on the board. You want to rush the board with 5s, but they're fragile. Just the way that the activated damage from other cards works is that typically they can only take 2 or 3 hits. And frankly, given the way that the turn structure works, that's just not enough in a lot of cases without things protecting them in the front. Because by the time you get them down, if someone has 2 or 3 cards in one rift that they can call all at once, they can just blast it off the board and you're not really making any progress. Or your progress towards a single column becomes more inefficient if your opponent can deal with it directly. Jake, I want to pivot because I think we've done a really good job talking about the depth of these decisions, and there's so much depth here. But I want to ask you a question, which is based on the values of the cards here. How much are you thinking about what cards not just can you take out on your opponent's line, but should you take out on their opponent's line? Like counting 7s,
right?
Could they call a 7, or counting the number of elements roughly that could be left? How much do you do that in your play? Because I feel like I should be doing it more.
Yeah, I honestly think like counting, like card counting, I think is something that will become a huge part of this game at like high levels because it's pretty easy to do. But I feel like that's not something I've spent any time really thinking about my plays.
Yeah,
like I just don't feel like I have the bandwidth for that. I think what I'm thinking about more still is just trying to use my cards efficiently, and by that I mean like finding ways to, like, a hugely important rule in this game that I've found over the course of play that, again, didn't seem like much at the beginning is that you don't deal excess damage. So if I've dealt 5 damage to Brendan's 6 power element and I have a gem ready to unload on it, then I'm dealing 4 damage to that one, and that 3 damage is just like completely wasted efficiency. So I think what I'm trying to think about more as I'm playing more recently is placing my elements in a way that I'm just dealing like the right amount of damage to each one. And I think like doing that is a great way to gain an efficiency advantage over your opponent as well. But yeah, I mean, like, to your point, I think we have talked about the depth in this game a lot, and I hope it's really obvious to listeners, like, that we're just scratching the surface of, I think, what is capable in this game, and in this system, and to have all that in a game that literally takes 5 minutes to teach is pretty cool.
Yeah. I don't think that every game we cover on the show could sustain a 25 episode like sub podcast series. But I think Riftforce could. I think we could do. Yeah. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And I think like of all the games that we've played so far, Riftforce is like the only one like, oh, I can't. So it's in alpha on Board Game Arena right now.
Oh, you want the rankings?
Yeah. Like I was like, when this comes in, like I might try and like see if I can like climb up the ladder in this, which is not something I always want to do, but like this is just my type of game, and I think just like it scratches that same kind of like competitive itch that Keyforge did for me, or Magic before that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the depth feels like it's there.
Yeah.
Okay, for listeners, here are the things we're going to cover before the end of the show. We're going to talk about one other cool little design quirk. We're going to do our tier list live. And then we'll talk about the expansions a little bit. And then I think that will be the rest of the show, maybe some closing thoughts. But one thing, so that's just like where your head can be at for going through the rest of the show. Tier lists are coming. Jake, one thing that I think is really interesting about this game is the design of the values. So you have, and what I mean by this is whenever anyone's designing a card game with numbers on them, there's always a consideration of like what value should be in the deck and what's the proportion of those values to other values. We've covered that a little bit with the 5s, 6s, and 7s. Great. We talked about it. That leads to interesting nuance. But there's then in Riftforce, there's the design of the damage potential of the elemental types that's layered over this that I think is part of the magic of this game. So you have, from there, you have damage potential of 1 through 4, where 1 feels like nothing, like what am I doing with this stupid pea shooter? And 4 is like, wow, I'm just haymakers all over the place. And I think that the value design here of 1 through 4 locking into 5 through 7, because that's how they relate, right? Damage is always relating to 5s through 7s, and then elements are relating to the 1 through 4. I think that there's something about that math that's really, really well designed, and how they combined to lead to interesting decisions, right? Where 4 plus 1 can take out 5s, but 4 plus 1 can't take out 6s. 4 plus 2 can take out a 6, but for a 7, you need 4 plus 3. There's very few things that deal 3 damage. I think that there's lots of interesting ways that these numbers are overlapping that leads to some of the depth that we're talking about that I don't think we need to dwell on here, and we won't talk about why, but I think that just the fact that this exists is interesting and well designed.
Yeah, and it does like tremendously interesting things with how the abilities of different elementals interact with it. Like, for example, I found recently, this is short, I promise, but like water and fire interact really well together. And I think it's because those two elements together allow you to make a equal 5, 6, or 7 in a lot of interesting and efficient ways. So like 1 fire and 2 waters, that's 7. 2 fires and a water moving over a lane, that also equals 7, right?
Yep.
A fire plus a water, that's 5. A fire plus a water plus a moving water, that's 6, right?
Yeah.
So even though, and that's not something like that intuitively you would see like as those two powers like fitting together in the same way that like thunder and ice does, as like augmenting the power, but it just it's like augmented by the system itself.
Yeah, which this is a concept that I feel like is similar to card advantage in Magic, which is that it's abstract, but seems really important to Riftforce, which is just like overall efficiency. Like what you were saying, Jake, earlier, of like, if you use a crystal to deal 1 damage, you're wasting the potential of that card. You've thrown away the advantage that you have of dealing more damage, and you're getting less. So I feel like if there's one takeaway for like, I'm listening to this episode and I want to play Riftforce better, I feel like that's a really good one, is think about overall efficiency of what you're doing, which is like maybe the most obvious takeaway in a board game podcast ever. Like, yeah, duh, you should be taking into account obvious efficiency, Brendan. But I feel like in Riftforce, it begs repeating because it does really matter. Going over represents waste, and you don't have room for it in such a tight competition.
Yeah.
Okay, Jake, here's how I think we should do our rankings to get our tier list, okay? So there's 10 guilds. So let's each give our ranking for them in alphabetical order, and we each get to assign a 1 or a 10. Does that work for you?
I don't understand what that means.
Okay, so like I'll say air, and you'll say like, oh, that's a 7, or that's that's 5.
10. Out of 10.
Yep. Does that work?
Okay, sure.
You can't see the rating, so how are we going to do this? Do you have a piece of paper in front of you?
I have a sticky note. Okay.
Great. So write down the numbers that you've used. And let's start with number 1, I think.
Okay.
I'll go first.
Which is best or worst?
Which is best.
Okay.
I think Crystal is the best in the game.
Okay. I think Shadow is the best in the game.
Okay. So Crystal gets a 1 from me and a 1. Shadows gets a 1 from Jake. And then we're going to sum up all of these. And then the lowest value will be our top tier, and then we'll go down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, what's your 2?
My 2 is going to be Earth.
What?
Yeah.
You've gone up a lot on that. That's because our meta is shifting.
I know. It's like things are shifting so much for me right now that it's like kind of pointless, but it's still fun as a point in time.
Yeah, we're gonna go quick. It's not too serious. I think light is actually number 2. I really like light, so I'm doing light as 2. What's your 3?
I'm gonna go gem.
Okay, gem at 3. Interesting. I'm taking it too early in the draft against you. My 3. What do I think? I think ice is really good, so I'm gonna just go 3 on ice.
4 for me is water.
I think 4 for me is earth.
5. I'll put ice here at 5.
Okay, I feel good about that. And my 4 is going to be
Here, your
water.
5.
My 5 is going to be water.
Okay. 6. What is remaining for me?
So you have to choose from thunder, plant, light, fire, and air.
I'm gonna go fire.
Okay, fire is going to get a 6 for you. For me, for the 6, you're going to be shocked. I'm going plant.
No,
I think plant is
that's
really powerful.
You don't do it. All right, going on to 7. Light.
Wow, that's a huge delta for us. Light for me is 2 and 7 for Jake. What the heck? Okay, I'm going for 7 for me. I'm going to go with thunder or thunderbolt. I think it's literally thunderbolt in the rulebook, which is funny.
That's hilarious.
So 8 for you, Jake. I'm guessing it's not plant, so it's either air or
I know,
thunder.
And I'm like really debating about this. I think I'm gonna go with air. I don't like either of them.
But there's 3 left. Okay.
Well, yeah.
My 8. Oh no, I'm putting 8 as shadows, which is just wrong. I've messed up.
You messed everything up.
I messed everything up.
All right.
Okay, wait. What's your 9?
This is the best segment we've ever done on this one.
We're okay.
All right. Are you gonna adjust it? Are you gonna switch it?
I'll adjust it.
Okay.
At some point.
So 9 for me is gonna be Thunderbolt.
Okay. Which makes your 10.
Yeah, I'm gonna go 8 Thunderbolt, 9 air. I'm switching.
Okay. 8 Thunderbolt, 9 air.
And 10 plant.
9 air, 10. Okay, my 9 is gonna be fire. That feels low. And 10 air. I do think air is the worst.
Air can't be the worst when plant literally exists.
No. Okay, I'm adjusting mine really quickly because I'm slotting in shadows at 4.
Okay.
So everything else is going down by 1. Do you want me to read out our individual rankings, or let's just sum them up?
No, let's just do the consensus decision-based version 1 tier list for the elements in Riftforce.
So our number 1 combined best. No, let's do it the opposite way. We're going lowest to best.
Okay.
So tier 10, I guess it's the lowest tier. Okay, so we have air.
Yeah.
As the worst, then plant, then thunder.
I feel like you gotta chunk it out, like D tier, air,
Okay.
Plant, and thunder. I would feel good about those together there.
Okay, so the first 2 are going to be D tier. So plant and air are D tier. Now we're running into C tier.
Okay.
And we have 3 C's. Thunderbolt, then fire, then water. Though, no, based on how we have the spread of numbers, I'm bumping water up to a B.
Okay,
so
perfect. Yeah, I like water
fire and
B.
thunderbolt are C. Then water is B, light is B, and ice is B.
Okay, I can get behind all that.
I think actually also just based on how the numbers broke, Jake, earth is also B.
Okay.
It's 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we have shadows and then crystal.
That's an A
Interesting.
tier.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's good. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll publish this on the Discord because I know that listening to this in audio podcast form might not have turned out exactly how I'd hoped it would. But I'll say it again one more time here from top to bottom this time, and then we're going to post a visual version. But in S tier is crystal. I don't really know if it's S, but that's semantic. Then shadows, then earth, then ice, then light, then water, then fire, then thunderbolt, plants, and we have air as worst. But Jake, you admit we're not using air as well as we could use air. There's potential there. It's for when metas you can damage metas that are consistently going wide.
I think it's the opposite actually. I think it's good against people stacking up in one row because you can still chip away at them from the side.
Oh, from not moving into it.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you have a bunch of crystals in a row and I don't want to touch that, like potentially being able to still kill one of those crystals by chipping away and then finishing it off with a moving one is pretty valuable, I think. So I think it's good against I'd like to have air against earth and crystal, for example.
Interesting. Because earths naturally stack up.
Exactly.
Because when you play earth, you want to be able to do 3 damage by playing 3 earths together.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that was fun.
Yeah.
The expansion for Riftforce is not out yet, but there is an expansion coming that's adding 10 new guilds, which I think is really impressive from a design perspective. I think designing such narrow and straightforward but interesting powers is not easy. So there's a really cool BGG thread that maybe we'll put in the show notes, and if not, you can definitely find it in our Discord and we'll link it to you. But it's adding things like, Jake, I got to read these. They're so good.
They're wild.
Beast, lava. Okay, we're on track a little bit. Beast is kind of funny. Love, heck yeah. Magnet, oh yeah. Acid, yeah, okay, we're elemental-ish. Sand, music, hell yeah. Okay, wait, I have to read, and then magic, which is, aren't all of these magical? But the power for music, Jake, this is wild. Deal 2 damage to the first enemy in this location. If that enemy is destroyed by music, play it to your side of the rift at an adjacent location. So you can add powers to your board that weren't in your original 4, and then you have to call their value to use them. Yes,
that's
good.
Really cool. Yeah,
I love it.
I'm super enthusiastic about the potential to add to this game. I think more elements is probably only going to be better. Though my only fear is that, like, I think one of the strengths of this game is just how straightforward these elemental powers are, and as you add more complexity to it, it might just slow down the game. And I think this is a game that, like, you want to be playing it at like a snappy pace to enjoy it. I mean, we should be clear, like, this is a game that you can easily play in 15 minutes. And I think if Riftforce becomes a 30-minute game, because there's a lot of complexity with the elementals, and already obviously there's a lot of depth and complexity to the decision making, then I'm not really interested in it in the same way anymore. So I think that is like my only hesitation with like a full blown, like, hell yeah, crazy powers, but at the same time, hell yeah, crazy powers.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think it'll be. I also think just due to the combinatorial math aspect, if things start to feel samey for you in playing with these 10, adding 10 more things will never feel samey again. Yeah. There's just no chance.
And also, I think like it's like each one of these coming into the system reinvigorates all the old ones that you're familiar with. Like, I think Beast was like, when it can move around, and it does like extra damage when it moves if it's already damaged. So like that's obviously good with fire, which does 3 damage to your opponent's element and 1 damage to any of your own in that row behind it. So like all of a sudden, like, fire not being like exclusively a drawback, that's like, completely changes that potential.
Yeah. I think that maybe for my closing thought, Jake, one of the core strengths of Riftforce over some of the other games in this genre that we've talked about, and the real thing that sets this game apart from things like Air, Land, and Sea or Lost Cities, is that, in my mind, those games are incredible. But one issue with those games is that certain hands you're dealt in those games can be losing hands that you cannot win from. So the design fix in those situations was to build a structure that makes it such that the impact of any one round isn't the deciding factor in who wins that game. In Air, Land, and Sea, you have a concession mechanism, and you're going to play to 21 points and get a certain number of points based on how many rounds you win. In Lost Cities, you play 3 rounds, and the winner overall with the most points is winning, just to help balance that out. Riftforce doesn't need it. And that's because I think you have so much agency over the hand you're dealt, and there's so many ways to interact with the hand you're dealt. So for me, the standout thing about this system is it is of this genre, but overcomes one of the core pitfalls. And for that, I think makes me admire it tremendously as a design.
I agree with that. I think I should say, like, I agree with that, like, with the caveat that I'm not sure I yet fully understand how important the hand you're dealt is.
Or the cards you draw.
Exactly. And there have definitely been like feel bad moments where you draw 5 cards and just need a 6. And you still don't have a 6 to activate. And that might be just a losing board state at that point when previously you were in the match. And similarly, I think it's really helpful in this game if in your first hand you have 2 sets of 3 elements that you can play to the board. So it could be 3 of the same element, and then also 3 5s independent from that. Because then you can. It's really nice, I think, to play down 6 elements as your first 2 plays, and then draw 6 new cards. And some hands afford that, and some hands don't. to an extent where like I would be very happy like if this ever became like a game for like a tournament game, like I would add a mulligan rule. Like I don't know why not.
Yeah.
So I think there is, yeah, I agree with you, but also like there still is that card gamey randomness that is going to be the luck of the draw is always going to matter, and I think that's fun. And like figuring out ways to like work around that and still win games, totally possible, is part of like the fun and excitement that comes in the best of this dueling card game genre.
Those were really good caveats, and I just want to say Jake's awesome, and I'm really glad he's here because I take back what I said. It minimizes some of the issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so my final thought would be I hate ending on like a negative note, but we never got into like my kind of main criticism with this game, which is that I think like this is all mitigated by the short length of play, but like there's no comeback mechanism here at all. And like once you're down in a game of Riftforce, it's
you're out.
over. Yeah. There's no coming like in Magic, the Gathering, like you can play to like specific outs, or there's always the glimmer of hope that maybe your opponent all of a sudden will start drawing a bunch of lands or not the lands they need or whatever that's going to kind of like keep you in the game. That doesn't really happen in Riftforce. Like, and a lot of times if you're down, 3 full points, I don't know that I've really seen any comeback from that as well. And I mean like after a round, like not like, okay, you're down 3 and then you get 2 points on your next turn to get down 1. But like you're passing back to your opponent down 3. It's like, yeah, that you maybe can just concede at that point.
I've definitely had games where I've been down by more than 3 and come back, but not come back in 1.
Right. Like
which is what you're saying. Yeah, right. You can make it close, but that doesn't feel good.
No.
They feel like slogs.
Yeah. So I think that, and I think that's just something like inherent in the system that it's just everything. It's just snowballing. Like if I'm ahead because I'm killing your elements, that means like I have more presence on the board than you also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've leveraged the chief response to that from what everyone will be, which is that it's a 50-minute game, just play it again, which is, fine,
for sure. Yeah.
Which is why,
like, if this is a tournament game, let's add that mulligan and best 2 out of 3, no problem. You could get that done in 50-minute rounds. So that's perfect.
Final Rift to Nation.
Yeah.
See us there.
Yeah, that's right. Chris, gems only.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine how bad that would be? Only Crystal Riftforce? Okay, Jake. Well, this has been an awesome episode. I think either way, our follow-up is going to be a really nice companion piece, whether we're talking about Lost Cities, which is sort of hearkening back in a lot of ways. Like, it's clear that this game is in some ways inspired by the roots of games like Lost Cities. So I think that could make a really interesting comparison. Or we're going to talk about depth and size of decision spaces, which, we're probably trying to bite off way more than we can chew with a What We Talk About episode about both those things. But there's benefits to talking about them both, so we'll do it. And then if we want to talk about them both more again in the future, we will. So either way, listener, you're in luck. Decision Space is going to continue to be an awesome podcast. I can promise you that. I really appreciate you listening to this long episode of Decision Space. We've been going kind of long lately. If you enjoy that, let us know. If you don't enjoy that, let us know. I know some people have been like, if you guys go over 60 minutes, I don't like the show anymore, which is like totally fair. I've been there with podcasts and been like, why are they still talking? Like they said everything they needed to say by the 45-minute mark. But I hope you don't feel that way about us.
If you are one of the select few that made it all the way to the end of this podcast, you are the best. You are a true fan, and we are so grateful to you and everyone else who takes a little bit of time out of your day to listen to Decision Space. Until next week, our links are in the description of this podcast. And I think I'll be continuing to play Riftforce quite a bit after this podcast recording, which is not always the case. So that's always a good sign.
Likewise. I felt like I was going to take a break. And now I feel inspired to come back in and like dust off the old riff rocks. The theming is pretty light, but that's okay. I'm going to dust off the riff rocks and get back onto the fourth. I don't know. We'll see you next week. It's going to be good. Have a great weekend, y'all. Bye.